we will be talking today about, we heard from others earlier, we heard from David Foster, who described the Wildlands in New England report, the report that came out in 2023, and he showed a map. Where are the wildlands was the question on the map, and showed where the wildlands are in New England. Well, where are they not is maybe a different kind of question. It's the inverse. So where are the wildlands? Where aren't they? And remembering the Maurice Sendak book, Where the Wild Things Are, Where the Wildlands Are, Where the Wildlands Are Not, Where the Wild Things Aren't. And so we want to talk about ecological representation of wildlands in the Northeast. We've expanded the study area from to include New York. There have been many visions, as David described earlier, over the years of expanding wildlands in New England and the Northeast, many very, very expansive visions. But we have focused on really the question of ecological representation. So we heard from Leslie Jonas earlier about Cape Cod and about how developed things are in that part of Massachusetts, how the development has changed the landscape so much, and the wonderful beech forest that remains in Provincetown, right? And then we heard from John Leibowitz, who mentioned Muddy Pond, a wilderness preserve in southeastern Massachusetts. These are little gems in the landscape, very small areas in a very developed landscape. These represent ecological communities that are completely different from what's in the Adirondacks or northern Maine, and they're really, really important. So what our project has done is to identify ecological communities that are underrepresented as wildlands. And many of these do fall in the more developed areas of New England and New York. So that's the nature of this project. How do we spread the wildlands to all ecosystems and all species, all natural communities? So I am not going to give the full bios for the collaborators on this project, but they are Brian Hall of Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, who is a master at managing data and is an ecologist and can manage data at the same time, which is a wonderful combination of skills. Bob Zaino, who's been works for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department and has done a lot of conservation planning in his time, particularly Vermont conservation design, which serves as a model for a lot of this analysis. And Jason Mazurowski, relatively new with Northeast Wilderness Trust, wildlands ecologist, and Shelby Perry, who directs the ecology program at the Northeast Wilderness Trust. So this has been a really fun collaboration. The five of us have been working together on this for a while, and have lots, and I'm going to let them do the rest of the talking. But I just want to say thank you and to all of them for the opportunity to work with you. Three of the people here actually in this group are graduates of the UVM Field Naturalist program, and that's where I met them, which is really sort of wonderful. So anyway, with that, I'm going to hand it over, I believe, to Brian Hall. Is that correct? Nope, Jason's going to start. Okay, Jason. So the rules are just make sure you're speaking into the mic, make sure you're in the pool of light while you're speaking.
All right. Thank you, Liz. So I'm going to go pretty quick here, because I'm basically just giving a recap of what David Foster and John Leibowitz covered this morning. I'm not going to do it as thoroughly or as eloquently as they did. But as Liz mentioned, that sort of sets the stage for where we're headed with this wildlands representation work. So just a brief agenda of what we're going to be talking about over the next 45 minutes. First, I will introduce the topic, which is now. Give you a few definitions, a little bit of recap from the Wildlands report. Then Bob Zaino is going to take the mic and talk about Vermont as a case study for wildlands representation. And then Brian Hall is going to dive into the meat of this whole project here and discuss the tool that we've been building over the past year plus, the results that we've uncovered from building that tool, and soliciting feedback from you all, because you will all be some of the first people to actually see this tool live. So very exciting. At the end, we'll get to see that. So again, a recap, what are wildlands? This is coming straight out of the Wildlands report published in 2023. Wildlands are tracts of any size and current condition permanently protected from development in which management is explicitly intended to allow natural processes to prevail with free will and minimal human interference. Humans have been part of nature for millennia and can coexist with, or within and with wildlands without intentionally altering their structure, composition, or function. So again, coming back to that concept of freedom, wildlands are self-willed lands that have the freedom for ecological processes to prevail. So we've seen a version of this map before, if not the exact same map. So New England currently is about 81% forest, and it's not to say that most of that forest land is not conserved. That's not to say that natural processes are not unfolding. They are across the landscape. The difference, though, is that, and what sets them apart, these 81% apart from wildlands, is that those natural processes are unfolding under the direction of human management. So the species that live there, how old they get to be, the forest composition and structure is all decided essentially by human management. But then we have the 3.3% of the landscape in New England that is wildland. So these are those self-willed lands. What species grow there, how old they can become, the forest structure is all dictated by nature itself. They are self-willed lands. And I will note that we built this off of the Wildlands report, the Wildlands in New England report, which focused specifically on New England and excluded the Adirondacks, or the Adirondack region of New York. We included the Adirondack region in our analysis, and hopefully we'll touch on why that is a little bit later. But when you do add the Adirondack Park into this mix, that 3.3% goes up by a substantial margin. So next, I will hand it over to Shelby to discuss wildlands and old-growth forests.
Thanks, Jason. So if you were in the last session, we just talked about definitions of old forests, and I think we landed at a somewhat unsettled place. And I'm not going to settle it any further for you. I apologize. But so we're talking a lot in this presentation about wildlands and old forests, and I just wanted to kind of reiterate, as Jason just said, wildlands refer to a protection status, protected as forever wild, and old forest refers to a forest structural condition that remains somewhat ill-defined. So thinking of these things as a Venn diagram, not to scale, obviously. Many of the wildlands protected in the Northeast have not yet developed old forest structure, but some have. Likewise, some of the old forests in the Northeast are protected as wildlands, but some are not. And so the actual scale of this is hard to know, like how many old forests are protected versus exist unprotected in the Northeast, because we actually just don't have a great handle on how many old forests are out there. And I'm using old forest sort of specifically not old growth forest for all the reasons that were discussed in the last session if you were here. And if you weren't, you should watch the recording. So for Vermont specifically, I put this, I'm going to say ever so slightly closer to scale, but still not actually to scale, which is 3.7% of Vermont, where we are, is wildlands. And less than 0.5% of Vermont has the characteristics of old forests that we know about. And there is some overlap of that. Some of those areas of old forests are protected as wildlands. Some of them are not. Again, we don't really know how much overlap there is there because we don't have a great inventory of old forests. But these old forests, this level of protection is critical. on old forest because it will allow that continuity of process and build into that nebulous definition of old growth, hopefully someday. And so this is sort of all well-trodden ground at this point at this conference, but I'm gonna talk a little bit about these old forest features support a suite of species that rely on these minimally disturbed forests. This graphic taken from Newt being Northeast Wilderness Trust, Wild Works paper on biodiversity published in 2021 shows some of the biodiversity values of old forest. There's sort of some call outs up there. I won't read them all to you, but they have an abundance of microhabitats and coarse woody debris and things that create habitats for more biodiversity. And the suite of species can change with the forest type. So the biodiversity values of protected old forest of the northern hardwood assemblage are different from that of a spruce fir forest and so on and so forth of all the different ecological habitat types. So ideally, wildlands protections would be proportionally representative of the different types of forest communities across the entire region. This map is showing sort of our initial analysis. We included all of New York. You can see what Jason was talking about there, the Adirondacks, pretty well represented in wildlands protections across the Northeast. This is using EPA ecoregions and the percent protected, they're colored by the percent protected as wildlands. So I'll point out a couple things. One is that you can sort of see some little freckles going up the Green Mountains and across the Whites and into the western Maine Mountains. Those are all high elevation areas. That's one ecoregion that's sort of sprinkled across the whole thing. It's many shapes, but it's treated as one ecoregion, and it's high elevation. And that is great news, well protected in wildlands, which is important and valuable. But I think the other thing this map highlights is the other areas where wildlands are really lacking. They're not a high percentage of the protections. And so we started this analysis with sort of a handful of goals that we have been tweaking and working on over the process. And we've landed at these 3 goals for ecological representation in wildlands. I won't read them all out. I'll leave them up here. You guys can read them. But broadly speaking, protect at least 10% of every ecoregion as wildland. This is a little bit different from what's in the Wildlands report, which is about sort of a minimum of 10% broadly across the region. So we use 10% sort of as a baseline if we wanted to have representation, and then there's going to be some protections that go beyond representation, and that's okay. It's great, in fact. But if we want to make sure we're capturing sort of the full suite of these ecological communities in wildlands, we want at least 10% of each of them. And so representing each ecoregion's natural communities and wildlands is our second point, and then making sure that when we establish those new wildlands, we're trying to do it in large and connected natural lands. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Bob to talk a bit about that.
Thanks, Shelby. Just before we started the talk, Shelby said to me, somewhat ominously, "You have 10 minutes and 24 slides." Oh boy. I work for the Fish and Wildlife Department here in Vermont, and our mission is the conservation of all species. And this is going to get to how I tie into this project. Part of the way that we achieve that mission of conserving species is thinking broadly about conservation at all scales, using the most efficient tools to conserve many, many species. We've got something like 20 to 40,000 species here in Vermont. We need efficiency, not species by species. And a lot of that efficiency is built into this project called Vermont Conservation Design. Vermont Conservation Design is, at its most basic level, a prioritization at different scales of places that are most critical for maintaining ecological function in Vermont. The sort of overall way we can describe this project is it identifies places that collectively are intact, connected, and diverse. And I really want to focus on this diverse part of Vermont conservation design here, because it really is about representing all the different natural communities in the state and across all the different biophysical regions of the state. One of the features that we have in Vermont conservation design is to have targets for old and young forest across the landscape. We want to bring back that forest structural diversity. And we have this goal of about 10% old forest to be reestablished here in Vermont as part of Vermont conservation design. It has this wonderful overlap with that wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and community vision. Why old forests? Well, they're, along with young forests, both of those structural conditions really support different species diversity. Somebody mentioned this graph in the last talk, and here it is. Part of this Vermont conservation design is we have this percentage goal. We can translate that to acreage targets in different regions of the state. So we have our biophysical regions outlined in black up there, and then we have this goal to eventually have, because we don't have it now for sure, to have these acreages of old forest, and ideally in these different patch sizes. So a logical way to look at progress towards that goal was to use the data from the Wildlands report to look at where wildlands might be contributing future old forest here in Vermont. Like Shelby said, that's not going to be an exact one-to-one overlap, but it gives us a good sense of how we're doing on those Vermont conservation design goals. And so with Brian Hall's help, we were able to look at the different biophysical regions and look at the overall goal for future old forest set in Vermont conservation design, and then the amount of wildland conserved in each region. That's what this chart shows. The text was supposed to be larger. The two really long bars are the northern and southern Green Mountains. And all those other regions have relatively low levels of wildland conservation. The two colors, the green is weak wildland, which might just be administratively protected, and then the blue is strong wildland, which is like Forest Service wilderness areas or strong conservation easements. I want to focus in on the southern Green Mountain region. You can see that based on the wildlands data, just over time, we're going to end up with a lot of old forest in that region. We're essentially at the target set by Vermont conservation design. That's the region that we're talking about. Just, we might be in that region now. And there's a pretty picture of what wildlands look like in that region. This is in the Green Mountain National Forest. And another example of a wildland in that region along the West River, conservation work by the state and the Nature Conservancy. We can look at those wildlands, and compare them with modeled forest habitat types, or you could think of it as natural communities. And we can look at the main forest types, and we can say the green bars show the percentage of each different forest type in that region. So there's a lot of northern hardwood forest is that tall bar, and then the other bars are things like pine hemlock forest, montane spruce fir, and other types. And then we can look at how those forest types are represented in wildlands, which is the blue bars. And what we see is that something like northern hardwood forest, the tallest bars, they're relatively proportional, but the montane spruce fir forest, which is the third from the right, again, I'm sorry, the text is not bigger. The blue bar is much higher than the green bar, which means that we've got much more of that montane forest in wildland than would be proportional for that region. We've overrepresented, or done very well at representing high elevation forests in wildlands in that region. We've done very poorly at representing low elevation forests in those regions, which are the two with the gray arrows pointing at it. Those forest types, hemlock northern hardwood and pine hemlock hardwood, are just not represented in wildlands in that region. And that has biodiversity implications. It means that we are not setting aside examples of those forest types as to operate under natural processes, to develop the complex structures over time, and see the outcomes of those places. We are doing that a lot with the montane spruce fir, not so much with these hemlock northern hardwood forests. So where are those? Maybe we want to create future wildlands to represent those forest types and not put more in the high elevation forest. We can find those on the map. They're in those areas outlined in red. And the point that I want to make here is that those are places where there's not a lot of existing conserved land. They're not in, say, the Green Mountain National Forest. They're in other parts of the landscape. And we can't just keep focusing on what's already conserved and expect to get representation of all of our different ecosystems as wildlands. I want to contrast that with another region here in Vermont, the Champlain Hills, which is the lowest bar on this chart. And you can barely even see the slice of the wildlands there. It's a region where there's been essentially no conservation for future old forest. And so that identifies another potential gap where those natural communities in that region have not been well represented by this type of conservation. And this is a region up in the northern part of the state, has lots of rich, diverse northern hardwood forests, does not have that type of conservation except for a very small number of acres. We can scale up that type of thinking. How can we better represent these future old forests across all different types of natural communities in all ecoregions? Broadly, this is the map that Shelby showed of the percent of each region in wildland. We can dig even deeper and think about what types of forests are there distributed across Vermont and across the region. And then how well are each of those forest types represented in this form of conservation? And this is where I hand it over to Brian, who just walked out the door.
I've heard all that. Thanks,
there you go.
Thank you. So I'm going to take about 10 minutes or so to talk about the GIS analysis.
Just say your name and
Oh, thank you. I'm Brian Hall, and I'm a GIS analyst, and I do a lot of work with the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmland Communities Group. And so I'm going to talk for 10 minutes about the the GIS analysis. I want to talk about what we did, the data sets we used. And I'm not going to get too egg-headed. I'm going to just sort of give you a brief overview so that if you look at the web map, it's just how we're sort of letting the public see the data so you understand what's going on there. And so this is there we go. That's my first slide. So we took our mission sort of right from the Wildlands report. Basically we want to establish more larger wildlands in a connected network that secures the full diversity of nature in all biophysical regions. And so the way we did that, it's actually kind of a really, really simple analysis. First, we had to quantify the percentage of each major forest habitat type in wildlands, and Bob gave us a little teaser of that. And then we want to identify the most intact landscapes for each of those habitats. That is, we want to find the best landscapes for all those habitat types that are not adequately represented in the portfolio. And then we want to combine these two things in a really simple manner so that people who are not data scientists can understand them and use them in their conservation work and make them available to others. So we started out the analysis part by dividing New York and New England into 73 different ecoregions. So these are level 4 ecoregions. And they're basically areas of similar geology, often similar landscape histories, and similar landscapes, urban, rural, exurban, et cetera. And it sort of allows us to account for subtle differences in habitats due to local conditions. It also ensures that we'll identify the best places within each ecoregion for more wildlands. That way we'll have wildlands in suburban areas and not just have them all being placed up in the Adirondacks and the Catskills in northern Maine where they already are. It also gets at the all biophysical regions clause in the Wildlands report. And by having high quality wildlands identified all across the region, that gives something for every land trust to work with and to work towards. Bob mentioned the forest habitats data set we use from the Nature Conservancy's Northeast Habitats data set. And we're focusing on large forest, matrix forests, and very large forest patch types. But we want to remember that there's all kinds of, we've been calling them ecological gems across the region, fens, swamps, marshes, et cetera, that are certainly worthy of being in wildlands and should always be considered for wildlands. But we're focusing on patches for a few different reasons, matrix forests for many reasons, but also those gems will often be sort of surrounded by a matrix of forest that we're recommending for wildland. So what I did is we took the ecoregion data and we intersected it or overlaid it with habitats data. In this case, we're just seeing the matrix forest types. And again, this will help account for any local scale variation within the habitats across the whole region. And I'm calling these eco-habs because we have to be specific with our words, and that's these eco-habs sort of serve as the basis of our analysis. And it's kind of a silly word, so I want to explain it a little bit. Just some GIS stuff. The analysis, we looked at New York and New England, which is like 84 million acres, and the computer basically separates the whole region into 30-meter pixels, which is about a quarter of an acre. So this sort of quarter acre is our really finest grain that we have. So each cell is assigned to an eco-hab, which is a combination of its ecoregion and its habitat type. And what this does is we get, so let's look at the gray. The gray is the northern hardwood forest, and so we have lots of northern hardwood forests in the Adirondacks or in the central part of the Adirondacks. We have some of them in the Berkshires of Massachusetts. And although they're both northern hardwood forests, we're considering them as separate entities, and we feel that both of those deserve to be represented in the wildland portfolio. They all have should be allowed to be free-willed, as we've been saying today. And then we overlaid the wildlands shown in blue and determined the percentage of each eco-hab that is in wildland. We've seen this one before, so I'll skip right by that. But basically, this is showing that same data, but with more contrasting colors. And to simplify things, we basically started giving out points. So the red stuff is the eco-habs that have their lowest percentages in wildlands, and we've sort of given them 5 points. It's not really points, it's just a rank. So those are the most need of being represented in the wildlands portfolio. And of course, you're seeing the Adirondacks, being less need for more representation. We're not saying you shouldn't protect them, but if you're focusing on biorepresentation, you may want to pick only the best quality areas in the Adirondacks that are not already wildland. Okay, so we've covered that first part. Now let's look at how we identified the most intact landscapes for each of the habitats. We use this data from Mark Anderson's shop, the Nature Conservancy. It's called Local Connectedness. And basically what they do is they look at a 3-kilometer radius around pixels all across the whole region. And they identify those areas, well, they score them based on how well connected the natural areas are and what percentage of the natural areas they are. So, no surprise, you're seeing in the Adirondacks, you're seeing lots of, high local connectivity, and it gets a little less as you get into southern New England where the cities are, near Boston, et cetera. No surprise there. But what we did is we ranked each of our eco-habs, again, it's the habitat within an ecoregion, into bins, so that every single habitat is going to be scaled 1 to 5, where each of those bins is 20%. So every single eco-hab, or every single habitat within an ecoregion is going to be identified. There's going to be 20% of them that are given the highest rating, the dark green. So now you're seeing it's not just in the Adirondacks. We have the bright green area or dark green areas all across the landscape. So somebody working in Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard, or even in the Boston Basin, they have high areas that are identified as being important for them to work in. This also gets at the idea, one of the ideas in the Wildlands report is that there should be wildlands available for everybody, even in the urban areas or population centers. Yeah, so we've done those two things, and now how we can combine them. The graphic, we took the biorepresentational need and the modified local connectivity. And we're currently looking, this is sort of how we're looking at it now, where we have this little chart. We have the need for more biorepresentation in the going down the rows, where our greatest need is down here. And then we're looking at the landscape context. So it's the least connected on the left and the most connected on the right. And so there's 5 and 5 categories. There's 25 possible combinations, and we just sort of are lumping them into these four categories, where these are the high representational need and high relative connectivity. So these are like, sort of the cream of the crop. On the upper left, we have those low representational need and low relative connectivity, and you can sort of see what that. So it's pretty simple analysis. So here's what the map looks like. So generally you're going to want to protect the dark blue areas if you're focused on the representational angle, and you want the most connected examples of each of the eco-habs. If you're focused on creating really big wildlands, you could start by focusing on the dark blue areas, and then the dark olive areas, which are the low representational need, but they're in a highly connected landscape. So, go for the blue ones first, and then if you're focusing on big wildlands, then go for the dark olive ones next. So we actually have handouts, which we'll put by the doors, I guess, at the end of the session for you to pick up. And there's a QR code on there, and there's a QR code here, which will take you to our project's landing page. And then on that, at the bottom, you see the view of the web map. It's a link there. And I guess we have time, right, Shelby?
We have 2 minutes.
Sure.
I can hand those out also.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just pass
Yep.
them around.
Yep. So we won't do the live thing, but this is a screen grab of the web page. So it allows you to view on the final data and the component data that we used. You can zoom in or out to your own area of interest. There is a little bar. Are you actually seeing the mouse? The pointer? No, you're not. But there's a bar up there at the top where you can type in an address, and the map will zoom to that area. So you can look at Loaf campus, Ripton, Vermont. You could turn on data that we didn't use in our analysis, but that are really important, such as protected open space. Or you could turn on the wildlands data set that David Foster showed us this morning. And this is still a work in progress. And so I guess we're accepting comments for like around 2 weeks or so. But you can, there's a link up at top. Well, there's instructions. Do that first. Look at the instructions. It's really easy to look at. It's quick. There's an area where you can leave comments. Please, 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 please take a look at that. And you're not just commenting on the web map, you're also commenting on our project, which will be really, really helpful. And then there's a link up at the top for about the project. So, yeah, I think we're ready for questions then.
Yeah, you got 1 minute.
Oh. Oh, you know what? This isn't showing up on the.
Oh, okay. Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Good thing, 'cause your minute's over.
Yeah. Here comes the hook.
Okay, any questions? And do we have a second mic? Okay, great, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Great presentation. I saw focus on 3 scales of analysis: ecoregions, forest types, and natural communities. But I know that characterizing natural communities is problematic, and you really didn't get down to that scale, and I suspect it's because a gem today may not be a gem tomorrow, especially in the context of climate change. And so I wonder, TNC at one point used to talk about setting the stage as being the way to address that problem. How are you addressing that problem?
That's a great question. Thanks for that. The way that we've thought about that in Vermont with our Vermont conservation design, I can speak to that and others can speak to maybe that more broadly, is the idea that the natural communities and the forest types that result from that are the combination of the physical setting and the forces upon it. And the actors over time will change. But I think we can have some confidence that the forests high on the mountainside are likely always going to be different than the forest or whatever vegetation is down by the Connecticut River or by Lake Champlain. And so the natural community concept, I think, encompasses that physical stage TNC idea that has that more, that longevity.
Did you say what a natural community is?
Is this a quiz? We define a natural community as an interacting assemblage of organisms, their physical environment, and the processes that affect them.
Oh, practice.
Okay. Who else? Bill Keaton, but well, we've got a question here. Chris Shorn, we'll start with you, and then we'll go back to Bill.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much. I have a question, I think, for Liz and Bob, but I'm thinking back to something, Bob, I think you drew attention to, which is on the spectrum, you can have weak wildlands and strong wildlands, which is sort of a function of the conservation instruments on top of it. And also related to the Wildlands of New England report from 2 years ago, which, you know, sort of looking across all the holdings. I'm coming from Maine, where we have lots of regional land trusts, smaller township level land trusts with lots of holdings. And, you know, I think I have this sort of a personal hypothesis that many of these lands may qualify for wildlands, and the only thing missing is this sort of stated intentional intent to manage them as such. So maybe this goes beyond the scope of your analysis and more into actions and future or next things to look at, but I'm wondering, you know, is it possible to meet these biorepresentational goals through enhancement of existing conservation instruments on existing conservation land, or can they only be met through new acquisitions of unconnected land and land that isn't conserved?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, Chris. Do you mind if I just go ahead and answer it? So, yeah, first of all, what are the definitions of weakly protected wildlands and strongly protected wildlands? That was, we actually, when we did the wildlands report, there was a whole gradient analysis and scatter plot of that, really. So it wasn't just, okay, weak and strong, but the things were included were the intent. It needed to have a strong intent, and then legal protection. How strong is the legal protection? And another aspect was how are people actually doing the management? Is it actually being carried out with the intent expressed? And we included in the wildlands data set some that do not have permanent legal protection necessarily, but because they've been protected as wildlands for so long and the intent is so clear, those were included. But if someone says, yeah, I think I want to protect that as a wildland, and they did that a year ago, and I think, yeah, that'd be a good idea, and they haven't done anything about it, that kind of doesn't count, you know, so that's down here on the scatter plot. So that's that part of it. The other part of it is whether existing conserved lands can be enhanced. Absolutely. I mean, that's the low-hanging fruit in some sense, right? That there are parcels of land that are protected without that intent, without that legal protection, but that kind of, there are things like overlay easements, so an easement that is set up so that it doesn't have a wildland intent. Perhaps another overlay easement could be added to it by the Northeast Wilderness Trust, for example. Not all easements allow that, not all organizations allow that. There's a lot of complexity in that, I'm sure you know, but that is, that seems like a really, as I say, kind of low-hanging fruit. So not necessarily, that was a long-winded answer, but Bob has more.
Well, I just want to add to that I think one of the things that this analysis really highlights is that if we want to think about using wildlands strategically as a tool to represent the full diversity of forests in the Northeast or Vermont, wherever, we can't do that just by changing the conservation status of existing conserved lands. Our existing conserved lands are not representative of the ecological diversity of our region. And so what this points to is we need to think about other tools, other strategies to get that diversity represented in this type of conservation and I think, frankly, in conservation broadly.
Yeah, so I think this brings up the question that is a big question, is can public lands solve this problem for us? That's an aspect of it. And there's, the answer, I agree, is no. No, we need new conservation lands. So both of these things are true. But Bill Keaton, do you have a question? Did you have a question?
Sure, yes, thanks. So you might have already answered this with the last discussion. First of all, I just wanted to say that this is fantastic work. I just really commend what you've done, and it's feeding back as I get it closer. I love the fact that you're looking at representativeness across ecoregions and community types. It's incredibly informative that way. It just gives me a little bit of a pause, though, because you end up with a map in which 70 or 80% of the region is in this dark blue color. And so I'm wondering, what the next steps would be. I would assume, we could now think about layering other filters, such as a parcel map and just availability of large parcels for wildland conservation. You could also layer the kinds of functions that we were talking about this morning, or earlier this afternoon, like high biomass forests or critical positions on the landscape like floodplains. I'm wondering what the next step is that you're thinking about to help planners prioritize.
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing I do want to state is the image you're seeing has got a lot more blue on it than it really does. When you look in the web map and you start zooming in, you're going to see that there's a lot more white space and development in there. So do that. And we talked about all that stuff a lot. By the way, the web map does have parcel bounds. So if you're looking for being able to do a big deal, large acreage, you can do that sort of on your own. But we are talking a little bit about incorporating some more landscape type data in there. And the comments you suggested, certainly put them on in the comment box that we have up there.
Should we say something? I just wanted to say we talked a lot about, this is a biorepresentation specifically. This is a prioritization looking totally at that. There's a lot of other ways, as you alluded to, that you might want to prioritize land conservation, a lot of other factors you might want to look at. And we kind of went back and forth about how many of them we could put in this analysis. And as I'm sure you understand, sometimes one prioritization kind of cancels out another. So we really have been talking about kind of wrapping up this biorepresentation, or whatever we're calling it, habitat representation, and then maybe thinking about layering on other things. When we started this process, we also had a social layer that we talked a lot about, that was about equity and access. And then we all just sort of decided, a bunch of sort of forest and landscape ecologists are not the people to do that layer. So we're going to pursue that still probably, but we need to find experts in that. So stay tuned. Maybe newer prioritizations will come out and help narrow these things down. But this one is sort of very specifically about that representation question.
Thanks. Chris, right here.
Maps could yes, there's can. Maps can be very political at times, and conservation maps. Oregon, I think a couple years ago, published some new fire danger maps, and people got very upset. And sometimes with some of these conservation maps, people get upset because, hey, wait a second, my private property is showing up in this high priority potential conservation zone. Is that something you have thought about, or maybe too early in the process, or maybe that's for other people to think about?
Apparently I'm going to answer that one.
State guy.
I agree. I think that's always a challenge of putting things on a map, that it makes people feel like you're coming for them. But I think all of conservation that we're doing is, anyone in the Northeast is doing voluntary conservation. Whether it's conservation easements or public land acquisitions, it's all happening because of willing landowners making commitments to their land. So that's something, certainly with like our Vermont conservation design maps, we show 70% of Vermont as highest priority, not just for wildlands, but for all sorts of ecological functions. And that just means there's so many tools that we can apply to achieve conservation, and willing landowner transactions is just one of them.
Other questions? Conrad, back there.
Thank you, and thanks for this. What I was curious about, I'm sure you thought about it, is the layer of threat. So in other words, how fragile, how likely are these places to be impacted? And I was wondering, I could see how that goes against the idea of representing each area sort of equally, but I also wonder, just curious what your thoughts have been around that.
It appears we have a working mic here, so, yeah. I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Conrad. We did talk about threat, and whenever I do any kind of a GIS analysis or thinking, I like to do that. One of the problems is there's just really not good data on that. It's all modeled. There's also the philosophical argument about if you live in the Boston Basin and there's just a sprinkling of natural forests or forests, even those, you want to protect those. There's a high risk of development, but it's expensive. You could buy 10 times as many acres in northern Maine. So there's a philosophy there. But I also think that, if you work in your region, probably better than the data does. So maybe that's something that the actual user can consider. We were trying to keep this really simple, like Shelby said, focusing it on biorepresentation because it's sort of pure in that way, but also other people aren't doing it. But that's certainly something that should be considered. As things that Bill mentioned too.
I believe we're out of time for questions. We want to take a little 5-minute break before the next session begins, which is Marianne Patinelli-Dubai. This will be a plenary session. It'll be a wonderful talk and a panel discussion with some other people. So thank you so much for being here and for being attentive, and take a 2-minute, we'll start right at 4 o'clock with Marianne Patinelli-Dubai. Thank you very much.